Good afternoon. I am Amy Vanover. I'm a partner at Thompson Hine, and I'm so happy that you joined us today to hear from Matt Martin. As you know, for the past year, companies, communities, and systems of society, both local and global, have been challenged by the pressures of the pandemic and the exposure of systemic inequity. While the years long recovery from the economic, educational, and health related impacts is just beginning, urgent needs remain. In this webinar, Matt Martin, a community research and grants management officer at the Columbus Foundation, highlights the most pressing needs, the collective efforts and initiatives that have emerged to address these needs, and the ways to make Central Ohio a more resilient community. Matt is responsible for research, development, and implementation of effective social investments that strengthen and improve our community. Matt's depth of knowledge and experience in urban planning and community development helps position the foundation to be one of Columbus's leaders in this area of community need. Prior to joining the foundation, Matt was a researcher with the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. While at Kirwan, Matt produced the Institute's award-winning documentary entitled Free to Ride, and has conducted community assessments with partners around the country to help them understand spatial patterns of vulnerability and how to make their communities more sustainable by improving access to opportunity for their most marginalized members. Matt also managed the 2014 study of Franklin County seniors, and he was the lead author of the subsequent report, Meeting the Challenges of an Aging Population with Success. Sound interesting? Let's turn it over to Matt Martin himself. Matt?
Thank you, Amy, and thanks, Doug, for that intro as well. So many of the community trends and needs that we'll touch on throughout today are things that perhaps won't be new to you, and most certainly weren't new with the ushering in of the pandemic. But they are all things that require community partnership. And there's no one institution, no one individual that can take these on alone. And so just want to thank you again and show appreciation for your time joining us this afternoon, because it really is your community partnership and participation in this work that makes it possible for us to work on so many challenges and to address so many community needs, both urgent and long-term going forward. So with that, I will launch into a PowerPoint here, and we'll touch on a lot of those. So I want to start by sharing a couple visuals from the World Economic Forum. I don't know how many folks follow this. It's an annual resource, an annual assessment of sort of the top global risks that leaders around the world are paying attention to. Things that have, of course, tremendous economic implications, but things that threaten democracy, public health, social stability, and so forth. They release this every year, and for the past few years, there have been a few things that have remained at the top. Some probably won't surprise you. This is their assessment just a few years ago in 2018, and you can see high unemployment was still was at the top. Of course, energy, global fiscal crisis, national government stability, social instability. This is a version of the same assessment, and this one came out in January of 2020. And you can see that, of course, by then, extreme weather, climate change had really risen to the top. A variety of natural disaster, extreme weather, climate action failure really started to climb and take up a lot of the top five. Of course, we still see terrorism And then we also see technological challenges, things related to cyber attacks, data fraud, et cetera. And then, of course, we all know what happened shortly thereafter, which was really already underway, well underway by the time of the release of this information. And it's, of course, the pandemic. And, you know, there were scientists who had predicted before 2020 that there would likely be another pandemic. And even that it would likely come from a certain part of the world and be related to development and deforestation, and that it might even come from bats. So while there were experts in the field who had a pretty good idea that something like this could happen, it caught most of us somewhat by surprise, and certainly the length, the depth, the breadth of it, all the ramifications, certainly caught most of us by surprise. But the pandemic was not, of course, the only thing that really impacted people's lives last year, or over the last few years. Really, there were a number of things happening simultaneously throughout the year that really grabbed our attention throughout the year, even in the midst of the pandemic. Of course, the racial unrest that we saw, just really more and more people saying that we've had enough and we can't continue to allow this inequity, this injustice to continue. Of course, environmental impacts continuing in a variety of different ways, fires, floods, extreme weather across the globe. And then several other things that can continue to impact our world today that weren't new, not least of which, as many of us are still working from home and taking precaution on that front as well. Of course, we used words like unprecedented in unprecedented amounts throughout the past year or more, and yet, as we begin to see change and progress in this battle, we can look at the 2021 risk assessment landscape and see a lot of the same challenges on the horizon. Of course, technology being one of them. This is sort of a different way of breaking up that global risk data and looking at it by category. This shows the difference between world leaders and shapers and their perspectives on global risks versus other stakeholders around the world. And you can see technology is continuing to be a concern, identified as a risk. Of course, economic factors and geopolitical factors are among that list as well. These are probably not surprising, and we're seeing much of this in the news around the world today, this week, this past month. But you also still see the environmental concerns really at the top of this list. And now as well, societal things like infectious diseases, youth disengagement, public infrastructure, social cohesion erosion. So there are many things that have been challenging for a long time. And we would look at these and of course suggest that the pandemic didn't really introduce many new challenges, but what it did do is it exposed a lot of the long-standing ones that we have been dealing with or not been dealing with for a long time. So what does all that mean, right, at the community level? And what did that look like for organizations, for institutions, for businesses, for schools here in Central Ohio? Of course, it meant a lot. It meant a lot of change and a lot of adjustment and adaptation for all facets of our community. Of course, schools across Central Ohio had to change the way that they educate students in just unprecedented ways. Many were able to do hybrid throughout this past school year, but some, including Columbus City Schools, have been almost entirely remote for almost the entire school year. workplaces of all kinds have had to pivot. Of course, there's office workers working from home, but the safety precautions for frontline workers was a big concern and a need throughout the past year. The delivery of social services. How do you not only serve your clients in the community in this time, how do you protect and support the health and wellness of your staff and your volunteers? And especially if a lot of your volunteers are older adults and among the most vulnerable to the pandemic. Events, obviously a lot of events got canceled, and to look back to February of 2020 and to think that the cancellation of One Arnold Festival was as big of a deal as it was for our community at the time, to think how many more events were canceled following that. And then, of course, for nonprofits, especially, fundraising took on a whole new shape, and a lot of organizations had to really get creative and be adaptive in order to continue raising funds. The Columbus Foundation, looking just high level coming out of 2019 and going into that year, 2020, was about the mission of the community, strengthening and improving the community for all its residents, and held total assets nearly $2.7 billion, and was having record or near record years in grants as well. And yet the Columbus Foundation too was challenged throughout 2020 to really step up and help alongside so many other community partners to address the needs. We, as Doug shared, launched an emergency response fund, and we're making grants by mid-March of last year. And since then have made over $8 million worth of grants, over 200 grants to nonprofits locally, and saw donor generosity really increase and step up in that time of need. Here's just kind of a high level summary of that grant program over the past year. Social services making up over half of those grants, with another third roughly going to health organizations, urban affairs organizations, and of course education organizations as well, to really try and supplement what the schools were able to do throughout the past year. And just to highlight a few of those grants and give you some more specific examples. Imagine some of our shelters, our homeless shelters throughout the community, in the midst of the pandemic, trying to figure out how to safely house and protect the health of folks living in those shelters, of volunteers, of staff. They had to really get creative and think out of the box about how to find spaces and create social and physical distances. And so they, YMCA, which housed an enormous amount of folks over the past year, as they already do in normal times, a grant was made to them to help really address those needs and to create, quarantine shelters and in partnership with local hotels and motels to make sure that folks were being, would have space to recover, and that other folks in the shelter would be able to be protected as well. The community pivoted in so many ways. The charitable pharmacy, increasing, distribution of medication, and having to do that in new ways, of course. Buckeye Ranch, it works with youth, and the Star House, who works with homeless youth, having to pivot in the way that they care for and support youth in our community. Deaf services and so many other service providers having to adjust in the way that they connect with their clients. The use of technology was a big theme throughout the year with this fund. And we were seeing applications and requests not only for the needs of community members and clients as it related to technology, but of the nonprofit organizations themselves, that they would have the resources and the equipment, that their staff would be equipped to be able to do virtual programs and provide virtual services. You think about how much telehealth really took off. The numbers are staggering, and even hospitals like Nationwide Children's Hospital saw just crazy increases from less than 100 to in the 70,000 range for telehealth appointments year over year. And Southeast Healthcare was no exception in that, in their efforts to connect virtually with patients throughout the past year. Some other examples would be Homeport and the families that live with them in their low to moderate income housing units across the Central Ohio region, providing tenant support, not only that they would be able to remain in their homes and apartments, but weather the financial storm from layoffs and furloughs that took place throughout the year. And so many other examples. We see camps for youth, COSI organizations that, museums of all kind really pivoting to still operate despite massive hits to their bottom line as well. An example being with COSI that they generate over half of their annual income every year from spring break alone. And if you think about the timing of the pandemic and when things really started to shut down, the economic toll that it took on nonprofits across the community was significant. And yet they found ways to send boxes and bags home so the kids could continue to play and learn and experiment and explore from home. Fundraisers, as I mentioned, organizations across the community began hosting virtual fundraising events. And if you think it's hard to get folks to come out to an in-person event, think about how much more challenging it was throughout the year, and especially as the year went on, to get folks excited about showing up for another Zoom. And so the way that organizations got creative about telling their story, about telling the story of why their mission is so important, and how the community can still be behind them in these times, was amazing. It was amazing to see what organizations were able to do. Now, of course, so many of them are eager to get back to in-person events, but what we heard and what we saw across the community, both in fundraising, service delivery, is that they adapted in ways that they'll take with them into the coming year. And there's going to be a hybrid of technology and ways of engaging with clients and community members and volunteers and donors that is really a major silver lining that comes out of this year. One that, of course, no one would have wanted or intended to have to grapple with, but one that shows how adaptive and resilient our community organizations really are. We saw pinch points of so many varieties throughout last year, some of which are still really creating challenges as we try to get back to more of a semblance of normal. For example, childcare is one that is still a barrier to many returning to work and the workforce. Food insecurity, we heard and saw numbers that we had never seen before from food pantries across the community, seeing 200+% increases year over year in the number of people and families in need of food. Evictions, though there were supports for rent, though there were eviction moratoriums of a couple different kinds, evictions were still being filed and are still being filed. And it's important to remember that this is coming at a time when Central Ohio's housing market is as hot as it's ever been. And so when you take job losses and household income losses and the eviction onslaught on top of an increasingly competitive housing market, it makes that continue to be one of the big pinch points in the community. The digital divide, of course, as Doug talked about, was not something that was new with the pandemic, but that the pandemic simply really exposed as being a critical lifeline to services, to employment, to social interaction and civic participation. And of course, we saw with small businesses and nonprofits alike, just challenges across the community in accessing funds, really exposed the importance of having relationships and partnerships with local financial institutions, and the need to adapt and pivot to be able to support small organizations and small businesses alike. On the topic of food insecurity, another one of the investments from the Emergency Response Fund over the past year was significant support to Mid-Ohio Food Collective, which has in the past year rolled out a rebranding that really takes a much more comprehensive approach than ever before in addressing food insecurity, beyond the pantry, to the market, to the kitchen, all the way to the farm. So just another of the really critical investments from that fund. And again, among the many already ongoing challenges throughout the year, Columbus just continues to really grapple with an affordability crisis when it comes to housing. And just as we have been starting to really ramp up as a community through a series of partnerships and investments to address the affordability, the region is still growing, and it's a national phenomenon, but it's something that we're seeing be very persistent here in Central Ohio. Another of the Emergency Response Fund grants went to Impact Community Action, which, among many things, was providing critical support to help folks avoid eviction throughout the past year in the midst of everything going on. And so, we kind of see this plethora, this cadre of needs that were, again, they existed throughout the community prior to the pandemic. The pandemic has only served to expose them more, to exacerbate them more. And as we know, so many of these are related. These are not isolated challenges or needs within the community. So many of them really are related. And so what I want to touch on now is to really, in light of those, look at what the implications are for the future of Columbus. Because in this moment, as we sort of begin to take a rear view mirror look, but also, continue to look right in front of us at the challenges that are still very much on our doorstep, it's as critical as ever to find ways to balance the sense of urgency around these ongoing needs, but also acknowledge that there's a long game to play, and there's a long view to keep in perspective. And so as we look at some of these needs and these challenges and these trends, let's also be sure to take a look at some of the longer term implications and how we can be addressing those as well. This is a graphic from the Pew Research Center, and I think this should work, but I'm going to play it. And what it really shows is a massive demographic swing with respect to age that has been taking place over the past almost century. And what you can see from 1950 on through 2060, of course, is, and this is happening in other industrialized nations as well, a shift in the age makeup and composition of our nation. It's something that is just as relevant here in Central Ohio. You can see what that looks like both from 1950 through to 2060. Interestingly, if you also look at that by race, if you look at age by race, you start to see really some distinctive trends taking place. So whereas the most common age in 2018 among whites was 58, among other groups, it's more like 11, 27, 29, 28, and 26. And so you see multiple trends happening simultaneously with respect to age and race and ethnicity. This shows the percentage of each county that is 40 to 50% or 50% or greater people of color. And you see from 1980 to 2010, a pretty significant increase. You see it still mostly in the South and in the Southwest. But then through 2040, you really see it spreading throughout more of the United States. This is a trend that has been underway, is underway in Central Ohio. And if you look, again, between 2010 and 2040, you do see here in Ohio, in our 3C metropolitan regions, the center counties of the regions, sometime between 2010 and 2040, become greater than 50% people of color. And if we look at that just here within Franklin County, we can see how that trend has been well underway. But looking out over the next 20 or 30 years, how that might continue to shake out. Something happened starting in 2017 here in Franklin County that hasn't happened since Central Ohio began to be settled by folks like Lucas Sullivan. The white population in Franklin County is estimated to have decreased ever so slightly between 2017 and 2018. A phenomenon, again, of the aging population across the country and across our community, as well as where our growth is coming from, fertility rates, really a plethora of factors. And so whereas even with children, as of 2000, children of color made up 34% of Franklin County. They're currently 50% of our kids here in Franklin County. And what's so concerning about this, though, is the persistent inequities that we've, of course, really started to pay attention to and acknowledge more clearly and more vividly in the past year, but which were already there and which are, of course, long-standing challenges in our community. So when we look at poverty, for example, and the persistent poverty gaps, if we look at wealth, we still see tremendous gaps in wealth. If we look at, even things like infant mortality rates, there are persistent gaps across racial and ethnic lines, which, of course, is concerning as we think about these patterns and trends across our community. We also see, a significant growth in lagging, stagnation or in our poverty rate. We see poverty growing across the county, suburbanizing in many ways. And so if we take all of these trends and look at them sort of in light of not only the past year, but the past couple decades, and in light of the decades to come, what's really important is to think about what the long-term implications will be for our community, both economic, both social, workforce, housing, and there's a lot there, and it's too much to wrap your head around in one sitting, but it's worth acknowledging both the sense of urgency of the now as well as the long term, and it's worth acknowledging really the community partnership that it will take to address all of these challenges in tandem. And so with that in mind, I want to just share a few highlights from the past few years and over the next couple of years of how the Columbus Foundation has been thinking about this, how we've been investing both with the immediate urgency of the pandemic in mind, but also thinking about how to continue to address ongoing challenges and play the long game simultaneously. So A few years ago in 2018, we had a critical need alert, as we do every couple of years, and really lifted up both the growing challenge of youth homelessness in our community, but also the importance of early childhood education. And again, with in view of trends with children of color becoming half of our kids by the year 2020, these are challenges, these are critical needs that our entire community has to come around. And so we lifted that up a couple years ago and continue to do so in a variety of ways. In 2019, we contributed $5 million to a $100 million housing action fund that our community came together to put together, and that fund is being deployed into the community as we speak, and is really but one of a handful of new solutions and ways to address the affordability crisis here in Central Ohio. But it's the Housing Action Fund was a very big step for our community, and one that the foundation wanted to be part of. Last year, as Doug mentioned, we saw by far the biggest give ever with $32 million. The previous big give, I think from 2017, was $18 million. So to see the community and to see donors step up in such a big way in 2020 was obviously it put a lot of wind in a lot of nonprofit sails at a really critical time, really critical point in the pandemic. But of course, this year and going into the next couple of years, there's more to do. And so, as Doug talked about, we've charted a course to continue the emergency response fund, but to broaden it from not just the kinds of grants that we've been making over the past year, but to include digital equity as part of that investment, and more recently to highlight the real need to support our youth and at this time. Something that was, again, already a need in the community, but that we see because of the challenges not only of connecting through technology, but just the challenges of wanting to stay engaged in the educational process, in the educational system, feeling isolated, feeling like the resources and the support systems that kids often come to depend on were not available in the ways that they always had been, despite some of their best efforts, of course. And so we see things like youth violence increasing, and so many of the folks who work in that space they'll tell you that they're not surprised to see some of these challenges playing out the way they are with violence, and that the need is really to double down on support for our youth, to give them a new why, to give them a sense of hope, a sense of optimism, and to make sure that they have real opportunities to take advantage of, so that they have other choices. We last September, as part of our annual meeting, also unveiled what we're calling Project 21. It's really the continuation of some of these investments that I've highlighted, but really putting some focus on some of the key needs we see coming out of the past year. Addressing the racial wealth gap through investments in growing small businesses, and preserving the arts. Of course, if your revenue comes from large gatherings and indoor spaces, then the past year was extremely challenging for our arts organizations, and for them to survive, as a community, we really need to rally around them. And then continued investment again in digital equity and recovery from the pandemic. And so I share all that again to say that this is, these are some of the ongoing trends, patterns from not just the past year, but the past several years, and in some ways the past several decades. These are ways that the Columbus Foundation has been investing in but a few of these. But we know that it's it's going to take the entire community, and your partnership and your participation in that is really critical. And so with that, I just want to thank you again, and then give us some time to dive into the chat and do some Q&A.
Thank you, Matt. We're waiting. At this time, we don't have any questions for you. Anybody
Yeah, I'm looking at the question from Tom that he dropped in the chat about what we might expect from the largest portion of funds. We do think that could change. We think it will change. We think it is changing as organizations' needs evolve. Of course, the institution of the Emergency Youth Fund in and of itself is an acknowledgement that that's a need that's much more on the forefront now than we would have viewed it as a year ago. And so really needing to think about our kids and just the crisis, really the existential crisis that so many of them are in thinking about their future. And so yeah, we see those needs adapting and evolving, and of course so many other community partners are also trying to pivot as well. All right, well, happy to answer any other questions, touch on any other issues folks might have. But again, just thank you, and would encourage you just to be thinking about both the urgent needs and those needs that we have to keep in the forefront for the long haul as we think about the future of our community.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Doug. So we've been talking a lot about the anticipated significance of the public funding. The ARP is certain, $187 million to the city alone, even more than that to the county. And I think it's worth letting folks know that, sort of the magnitude of that. And it really, when you aggregate, if an infrastructure bill is passed, you aggregate all this together, it really is akin to kind of the scale of the New Deal. That this is not just, oh yeah, another CARES Act and another dollop of federal money, but really significant. And you want to describe how we're thinking about making sure that we're aware of where those monies are coming into our community, and gently in an inspiring ways, maybe ask the questions of our community. How can we make the most out of that, those spending opportunities?
Yeah, so I mean, Doug, you're right about the scale of being just something that's hard to kind of compare to anything that would be recent, in recent memory. So one of the things that we've had to do in this Digital Equity Coalition alone, for example, is to have partners and members of that coalition really starting to keep an eye on the various federal and state dollars that are available, when they might be available, what they can be used for, what the stipulations might be. And then, for organizations like the Columbus Foundation and other local funders, we really have to think about where our dollars add value. And of course, the amount of the dollars aside, we know that there's greater flexibility, both in how some of the dollars can be used, but also how quickly they can get to the organizations in need.